My name is Neil Navlik, and I am your host for this webinar today, which is entitled The Promise and Challenges of Offshore Wind Power. It's intended as an introductory session where we will talk about how it works, what it will be like, and what are some of the environmental challenges that are associated with establishment and operation of offshore wind power facilities. We have two experts to join us today to tell us about it, and they will be speaking one after the other. And then at the end, we can take questions, and we'll do the best we can to answer them and direct them to one or the other, or both of the speakers. So, first off will be Ms. Alla Winstein. Ms. Winstein is the founder and CEO of Trident Winds Incorporated, which is a deep water offshore wind project development company. In March 2022, Trident Winds submitted a lease request to BOEM, that's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which oversees these facilities, for a 2,000 megawatt offshore site off the coast of Grays Harbor in Washington State. In January 2016, Trident Winds submitted an unsolicited lease request to BOEM for a commercial scale offshore site off the coast of Morro Bay that became part of the Morro Bay lease areas that were auctioned out in December of last year. Alla was instrumental in negotiating a mutual benefits corporation with the Central Coast fishing industry. Prior to founding Trident Winds, Alla co-founded and was the CEO of Principal Power Incorporated, a developer of WindFloat, the floating foundation technology company, and Aqua Energy Group, a wave energy technology company. She was also a founder and the first president of the European Ocean Energy Association, which is an industry association there. Prior to being in the field of marine renewables, Alla managed multi-million-dollar domestic and international projects in the field of aviation. She is an appointed ambassador to the Department of Energy Women in Clean Technology Initiative, and has previously served as Governor Jay Inslee's energy appointee to the Washington State Coastal Marine Advisory Council. She is an active member of the American Clean Power Association and is a frequent speaker on the development of marine renewable energy. Alla holds a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey and a master's degree from the prestigious Thunderbird School of Global Management at the University of Phoenix. Alla, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the League of Women Voters to organize this webinar and talk in general terms about offshore wind development. I'll take the credit and the blame for kickstarting the whole offshore wind development in California back in 2016 when I submitted the unsolicited lease request. So today, unfortunately, I am not one of the developers. Trident Winds was still a part of the joint venture with Total Energy called Castle Wind. Some of you may have known me over the years as CEO of Castle Wind. We were not successful in winning one of the leases, and so we will not be developing the project. But I feel that I can provide a lot of information to a lot of people because of my experience and because I've been on the Central Coast for quite a while. And I think I can answer a lot of questions that you may have. So I have a presentation for you that I just put on the screen, and hopefully you can all see it. Yeah, we can all see it? Yes? Okay. So I will start with a picture of what the wind farm may look like. This is an installation of a demonstration project of WindFloat that was installed at the end of 2019. This is units that have 8.5 megawatt turbines. They install about 10 kilometers offshore of Viana do Castelo in Portugal. Why Portugal? Well, back in 2008, when Principal Power started, we had to go to Europe to develop technology. And it was only natural that after we did the prototype, it would go to the demonstration project. And that's what you see on the screen. So you can imagine that things would be offshore, quite offshore. You're not going to see them, but something of that nature, except there will be a lot more units than just 3, because this was just a demonstration project. So we're going to talk about a number of things. Why offshore wind and its value to California, what is floating offshore wind, and how to develop a project. And then I'm going to let Neil moderate the Q&A session later on. So why deal or why bother with offshore wind? Well, because offshore wind is an important resource that today California does not really have in its energy mix. This chart has a number of graphs that represent various energy sources, all clean energy sources, and their relationship to the demand curve. So the black curve, or the black line that you see there, is the demand curve of the state of California. That's this line right here. The yellow line is the solar energy, which is available when the sun shines, and you can see that that's available during the day, which is why energy prices and the value of that particular resource is actually lower, which is what that black line represents. Then we have a couple more lines. This bottom one is the onshore wind. So as you see on wind installations onshore, that is the resource that you pick up onshore. And effectively in California, we don't really have any more locations where capturing onshore wind resource is economically viable, because you need to be pretty high up on the mountains, and we just don't have that available anymore. Then the other 2 lines are what's known as an out-of-state wind. In other words, it's a New Mexico wind or Wyoming wind that could be brought to California. But the bright blue line is the offshore wind. And you can see how much more valuable that resource is compared to the demand and what's needed for California. So instead of kind of bringing in offshore wind or out-of-state wind, it probably makes a lot more sense to develop its own capabilities and its own resource that's available off the coast of California. Now, what is floating offshore wind? First of all, the outer continental shelf, which is where you're going to be developing offshore resources, is fairly narrow on the west coast of the United States. And because of its narrows, you cannot really put any fixed foundation offshore wind, which is the technology mostly used in Europe and on the East Coast. And that would be these foundations on the left-hand side that you physically put on the bottom of the ocean floor, and then you put the turbines on top of it. So because of the water depth, which spans very deep, very fast, we have to go to what's known as floating offshore wind technology. There are 3 or 4 or maybe more types of principles of the floating support structures. All of them derived from oil and gas industry, which is important because this is new. This is not really a new invention. It is more repurposing what was already used, what has been developed, standardized, permitted, with which we have a lot of experience, for the different use. As you know, the oil platforms, they're not very tall, right? They will have a lot of equipment on top, but they're not really tall. So the important element of the floating offshore wind development was to demonstrate that if the turbine is sitting on this floating support structure, it's not going to flip, and the turbine will operate as it's predicted per its power curve. So that is what the Principal Power did back in 2008 through 2011. We developed a prototype. Back in 2008, there were only 2 floating devices available on the market, or rather in the development. Today, we have over a couple of dozen, because people realize that the future of offshore wind is going to be in the floating, and that is really a simple reason that water depth is where most of the activities are going to be happening, and it's going to be deep. And we're all running out of the shallow water depths, which are closer to shore, or where the continental shelf is pretty wide. And so majority or most of the companies that have been operating in supplying equipment for oil and gas industry are now turning their attention to floating offshore wind. Now, there is a difference, significant difference between how you install those devices. when you talk about fixed foundations, which are these devices on the left, you're going to put your foundation in the ocean floor. Then you're going to bring a big barge and called the jack-up barge. And then you're going to put the tower and put the nacelle. So you do all the assembly offshore. Floating offshore wind units, on the other hand, assembled inshore at the quay. You build the foundation somewhere, you bring it to the place where you can put the turbine, the tower and the nacelle, and you do it all at a shipyard or at the quay where you put all the pieces together, and then you tow the whole unit fully assembled to install at the location where you already pre-installed the mooring. So the process of installation is different between fixed foundations and floating, and also the fact that you're doing everything onshore rather than offshore eliminates a lot of equipment demand, insurance costs, and the type of training the personnel is required to have for doing work offshore versus onshore. So here is the example of some of the units that are now available. The one on the left is called the high wind. It's so-called SPAR because it's a long cylinder. That was installed first at the end of 2009. Then the wind float, which is over here, that was installed 2 years later at the end of 2011. Then other devices came in 2013. And by the time we got to now, like I said, we have over a few dozen of devices available. Some of them are in the prototype stages, some of them are demonstration, some of them are in different stages of development, but one way or another, people are looking for improvements in industrialization. What we did in 2008, 2011 is demonstrate principle of operation, that the unit sitting on the floating support structure will operate as predicted, and it did. And now that we demonstrated that principles work, now we're entering the period of so-called industrialization, where objective of the whole development is going to be reduced cost of energy. And that is the objectives that all the technology developers are working on. Now, these are very big units. Just to give you the sense of scale, when a unit is assembled and when its blade is in a 12-degree position, it will be taller than the Golden Gate support tower. We're talking about 800 feet or maybe bigger if the units become bigger. They are wide. It's almost 400 feet in width. Now that relates only to what's known as semi-submersible. The spar, which is the picture you saw before, is going to be long, but it's not going to be as wide. And then there is also other devices which are called tension lead platform. They too will have a smaller footprint potentially because they use different principle of operation. But today, majority of the developments have been semi-submersibles, which is what you see on the screen. And that's about the size of the devices that you're going to see. Now, let's talk about the BOEM auction and what happened in California. Since I submitted the unsolicited list request back in 2016, BOEM went through quite a number of steps to get us to the point of the auction that was held on December 6th last year. Those actions included looking whether there are other people interested in the site, and they were. They did the call areas, which were the initial indications where development could happen. Out of those call areas, we found a lot of conflicts, especially with the Department of Defense, and some of the call areas were effectively put dormant and no longer developing, like the Diablo Canyon call area. It is not in the development anymore. And then eventually, after the environmental assessment that BOEM had to do a lot of public meetings, comments, and so on, they held an auction at the end of last year. There were 5 wind sites awarded during the auction, 2 in Northern California in Humboldt Bay, and 3 in Morro Bay. So I'm going to focus on the Morro Bay sites only because we are talking to the Morro Bay constituents, and that is of more of the interest to you. So out of those 5 winners, 3 of them are going to be developing this area in the Morro Bay lease areas. One of them is Equinor. Equinor was the company that expressed an interest back in 2016 and they continue to be interested in the site, and so they're one of the winners. Second one is the Central California Offshore Wind LLC, which is a joint venture between Ocean Winds and Canadian Pension Fund. And the third one is Invenergy, which is really the only US-based renewable energy company. Most of the other winners, well, all the other winners are really European companies, even though they have US personnel, they're headquartered in Europe. Everybody will have to follow a BOEM process. There is no shortcuts, and you have to go through the process that's prescribed in the federal regulation. And it is a very long process. Where we are today is right here. The leases have been granted last week, and now all the winners are no longer provisional winners, they are lease holders. They physically have signed lease. So after they have the lease, what they need to do is they're going to be doing certain amount of pre-site surveys, meetings, planning, and so on. And that will culminate in the submittal of the site assessment plan. That's what SAP stands for. That will take them at least a year to do. SAP needs to be approved by BOEM, and until it's approved, nobody can really do any site assessment or surveys. And only after BOEM has approved SAP, then developers will start doing site assessment and surveys to establish the baseline from the environmental point of view and overall general environment on land and offshore. After they've done the surveys, they're going to start doing what's known as a construction and operation plan. Until you know what's available on the bottom of the ocean floor, on land, or so on, you can't really develop your process on how you're going to construct and operate the farm. And so that comes after you do the surveys, and then you start developing construction operation plan. That plan gets submitted to BOEM and goes through the public commenting period. And after BOEM approves the COP, and it could approve with comments, it can disapprove. There is no guarantee that it will be approved. But depending on whatever happens, after that's submitted and approved, only then developer can start construction and operation. And so only after BOEM deems COP complete and sufficient, then BOEM is going to conduct environmental and technical reviews, which is basically EIS. And only after that, BOEM can approve the COP and you can start doing installation and construction and so on. So it's a very long process. You can see the numbers here, and the numbers represent years. Year to do site assessment plan, close to 5 years to do a site construction operation plan and conduct the surveys. Then another year for the BOEM to do environmental impact statement, and only then you're going to start construction. So we're at least 7 years away. On the first go around, it may even take longer, but it is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. That's important to realize because it is a very long timeline. Now let's talk a little bit more about the actual area within the Morro Bay and what does it mean. So these are the 3 sites that have been awarded. They all have to bring the power back to shore. And there are 2 points of interconnection that is possible. One in Morro Bay, which is over here. And the other one is in Diablo Canyon, which is going to be over here. Now, whether people will or will not bring the cable to one place or another, that will be up to the developers. They will all have to have grid interconnection, and that will determine where and how they're going to bring the cable. But basically, you develop a project, and this is a pretty good graphic that BOEM has been using for quite a bit. So you have units offshore that's sitting between, floating outside. They're going to be interconnected with so-called inter-array cables. This is where the power from one unit will be brought to the other and then daisy chain over to the substation. The substation will have to be offshore. It could either be floating or it could be sitting on the bottom of the ocean floor. But for today, everybody is thinking about floating substation. However, 7 years from now, things may develop and technology may advance, and we'll see where things are going to be. So each unit connected to the bottom of the ocean floor with a mooring line. It is really no different than you will connect the boat so that it's kept on station. And that's how each unit is kept where it's supposed to be. And then from the substation, you have one electrical cable called export cable that goes to a substation on land. And what we have on land, Morro Bay have a Morro Bay substation, and then Diablo Canyon has a Diablo Canyon power plant substation. So that the two interconnection points where the export cable can go to. Now, if you look on this map again, you will see a lot of squiggly lines, right? Those squiggly lines are telecom cables that coming out of Los Osos. So if you want to connect to the Diablo Canyon substation, you will have to put something to like a bridge almost over these cables so that you do not interfere with each other. So which way is going to go is going to be up to developers, and I'm not going to comment who is going to go where. We will see what they're going to put in their construction operation plans. Now, I know a lot of people ask me about visual impacts, and back in the day, I think it was 2018, 2019, I went to the Hearst Castle and I said, interesting. Are there anybody going to be able to see them? And so we did simulations to see whether it is or isn't possible to see an installation that's going to be in this Morro Bay wind energy area. The final coal area was a little bit different, but it didn't really matter because we were trying to see whether anything will be visible. And so we stood on Hearst Castle and took pictures from these 3 points and then did simulations. It was done by a company called DNV that specializes in true simulations. And remember that once you go higher up, your point of horizon is going to be further out, but also there is a curvature of the Earth that reduces visibility. And so that was important to see whether about 20 miles offshore and what about 13 mile or something, I forgot exactly that, 1,300 feet of altitude is going to make the installation visible. And so there are pictures, and the Morro Bay Harbor Department actually has those visuals that I brought, and they could be available if somebody wants to look. But basically, you can see what you will not see. The fact is that the installations will not be visible, and you can see how we simulated them, kind of saying, here is the arrays that will be there, and could you see them? And the answer was no, you cannot, because it's too far out, and it's beyond the horizon and the curvature of the Earth. All of that is available. If anybody wants to look at them, like I said, you can go to the Morro Bay Harbor Department, and I'm sure they can pull out those posters and you can look at them. Now, these units, as I mentioned, need to be assembled on offshore, right? I'm sorry, at the shipyard, onshore, and then they will need to be towed out. So for today, there are 2 ports that have been identified as potential for final assembly and bringing it all together, all the pieces and assembling them, Port of Long Beach and Port of Humboldt Bay. Both ports are pretty far away. It's 240 miles to Long Beach and 350 miles to Humboldt Bay. And so those units, as high as they are, as tall as they are, as wide as they are, will have to travel this distance if that is where they're going to be assembled. Whether it will or will not happen this way, I can't really answer, but that's what the plans are right now. So with that, I'm going to leave you with a video of the assembly and the tow out of those 3 units that you saw on the picture, on the first picture of the Windfloat Atlantic in Portugal. The assembly took place in Spain at a port called Ferrol. It's not in Spain, but please enjoy the video. Can you hear the sound? Can you hear the sound?
It should be an option on your share page.
Okay, let me see if I can share. Oh, there we go. Share sound. Got it. Okay. We'll do it again.
This is a new way of generating energy and an important step to fight against climate change. Portugal enters in a new era with an international acclaimed solution in the production of offshore renewable energy. the WindFloat Atlantic project, formed by a consortium made up of EDP Renewables, ENGIE, Repsol, and Principal Power, is the first floating wind farm in continental Europe, just off the coast of Viana do Castelo. This floating wind farm will allow the optimization of natural resources and will speed up the commercial deployment of this innovative technology. WindFloat Atlantic is an example of a more sustainable future for mankind, with the largest turbines ever installed on floating platforms. The total installed capacity of 25 megawatts will provide sufficient energy to 60,000 people throughout the year. This energy promises an endless source. The potential of wind is immense, and this renewable energy is an essential part of the worldwide decarbonization strategy, free of CO2 emissions. The WindFloat Atlantic project is the future we envision. Our mission has begun, and we will continue to nurture the power of nature to make our planet more sustainable. WindFloat Atlantic. Energy beyond the horizon.
Well, with that, let's see. Need to go back to my presentation and doesn't want to go there. Somewhere. Oops. So I will now stop and wait for the questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alla. Our other speaker is Dr. Crow White, who is a professor at Cal Poly, and he is a professor of marine science and conservation there. The overarching conceptual theme of his research is to understand spatial and temporal population dynamics of coastal marine species and how they interact with human activities and values out on the ocean, which includes fisheries, renewable energy, aquaculture development, and conservation. In line with Cal Poly's Learn by Doing motto, student-centered research is at the heart of Dr. White's lab. Focal research projects include seascape genetics for mapping patterns of dispersal of marine fish, lab and field studies of kelp forest, coral reef, and polar ecosystems, and bioeconomic modeling of our coast to identify practical spatial management plans for fisheries, aquaculture, wind energy, and other activities in the ocean for achieving both conservation and coastal community objectives. Dr. White received his undergraduate degree in biology from the University of Oregon, a master's degree in wildlife biology from the University of Montana, and doctoral degree in marine ecology from UC Santa Barbara. He's been a professor at Cal Poly since 2013, and he will tell us a little bit about some of the issues that will have to be addressed in the establishment of these wind facilities. Dr. White.
Thank you, Neil. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, League of Women Voters, for inviting me and all the registrants on this webinar. And also thank you, Alla Winstein, for that very informative talk. I really appreciated it. Okay, I'm going to hopefully screen share. Okay, so offshore wind and the Morro Bay wind energy area in particular, it's extremely exciting and has great promise, as Alla was just explaining. There have been some concerns about potential effects, negative effects on other things in the ecosystem, and I'm going to bring up three of those. One is fisheries, fishery activity being displaced or access being limited from within the wind energy area, reducing the value or landings of fisheries. Another is the effect on seabird populations due to birds being displaced or dispersed out of the wind energy area, or colliding with the turbines and being whacked and dying. And a third are whales and other cetaceans that whose populations could suffer due to entanglement. I want to explain here that, you know, these turbines and their cables are so large that there's no way a whale would get directly entangled with them. Instead, it's possible that something like secondary entanglement could happen, where derelict fishing gear gets caught on the mooring cable and then a whale passes by and it becomes entangled on that derelict fishing gear. Or tertiary entanglement, where a whale gets entangled itself on fishing gear, as you see in this image here, and then it passes by the wind energy structure and that fishing gear gets caught on the wind energy structure. So one of my research interests is to try to figure out, well, how can we minimize these potential impacts while also taking into account wind power. And so I really want to emphasize the objectives I have here are maintaining fisheries value and preserving seabird and whale conservation alongside generating renewable energy. I'm very much a fan of renewable energy. And if my objectives did not include wind power, then that wouldn't be kind of playing to all the benefits that could happen in our ecosystem from this project and trying to accommodate the other concerns as well. So the approach that I'm taking, and that's the focus of this seminar, is spatial planning. That is trying to figure out where we could put these turbines or the wind farms in order to obtain power and also minimize effects on fisheries, birds, and whales. I want to point out that this is a form of proactive management where I'm trying to identify areas that have minimal conflicts. This is different than reactive management, which is also really valuable. And reactive management is trying to reduce the conflicts given where the farm location is. So for example, trying to figure out if and how
You got muted.
You're muted, Crow. You're muted
Oh, okay, now I'm back on. Was I muted that whole time?
for a few minutes. Yeah.
Okay, I apologize. I'm not sure how that happened. Okay, well, I'm trying to take into account the fisheries concerns, seabird concerns, and whale concerns about displacement or collision or entanglement with these turbines, alongside trying to achieve renewable wind energy power. And I really want to emphasize that. My objectives here include wind power. So that's alongside trying to maintain fisheries value and trying to maintain seabird conservation. The approach to doing this is through spatial planning, where I'm trying to identify locations where the conflicts are minimal. This could be in addition to reactive management, which could be done once the wind farm is in place. And that's trying to further reduce the conflicts. For example, by figuring out ways for some fishing activity to happen within the wind farm, or for the seabirds, perhaps painting the turbines specific colors or changing out the lights on them so that the birds don't collide with them or are not attracted to them, or even having sensors that identify flocks of birds and rotate the turbines so the blades don't spin, or rotate the blades so the turbine doesn't spin and the birds don't collide. Or with the whales, perhaps monitoring the cables for derelict fishing gear or monitoring whale activity. All of that is outstanding reactive management. What I'm focusing on for this presentation is proactive management through spatial planning to identify locations that minimize overlap between the wind energy production areas and fisheries, birds, and whale activities. I'm going to do two scales of analysis. One, we're going to look at the entire Central Coast, and then we'll zoom in on the wind energy area. So let's first look at the entire Central Coast. This is a map showing potential wind energy power in megawatts off of our coast. And the borders of this map are basically delineating where wind energy could be developed in theory. It's not super close to shore because that is state waters, and so that's off limits. It's not further west because that's too deep for the technology. It's not further north because of the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and it's not further south because we're outside of Central California. The take-home message from this map here is that the power is greatest farthest from shore. And if we look at the wind energy area, which is this green polygon here, we see that it's quite well positioned because it's far from shore. Now, one could suggest a few other alternative locations where it should have been put. So for example, the western edge has high wind power. The Santa Lucia Escarpment sticks out a little bit further than elsewhere, so that has higher power. And Point Conception has really strong winds, so that's an area that it could have been located. Keep those in mind when we start to talk about fisheries, seabirds, and whales. So let's jump to fisheries. So on the central coast of California, fisheries is dominated basically by 3 different species. We've got Dungeness crab, the groundfish fisheries, which is a whole bunch of species together like rockfish, sablefish, halibut, and other groundfish, and squid. If we look inside the wind energy area, it's almost entirely dominated by the groundfish fishery in value and landing. And that's not to say that most of the groundfish fishery activity in Central California is in the wind energy area. In fact, it's the opposite. If we look at a map of the value of the groundfish fishery on the Central coast of California, most of it is outside the wind energy area. About like 2 or 4, something like that, % of Central California's groundfish fishery landings and value is within the wind energy area. So a very small amount. And I think it's important to have perspective and realize that. So this indicates that the wind energy area is pretty well positioned because it's outside most of the fishing activity. There are other areas that we've talked about or one could consider, like I had brought up the western edge for wind power, but you see now the western edge has fisheries activity, so that's not a good idea anymore. The Santa Lucia Escarpment also has fisheries activity, so that's not a good idea. Near shore, there's lower fishing activity near shore for groundfish. However, for other fishery species, fishing activity is higher. So that's not a good idea. And also remember, the wind power generation is lower near shore. So that's not a good idea. Further north, we see some areas where fishing activity is lower, but that's not possible because it's the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. So really, that only leaves us with Point Conception as a possible contender of another location where the wind energy area could have gone, because we see that there's not much fishing activity there for groundfish and for other fisheries. But hang on to that for a second, and we'll address Point Conception. Okay, let's jump to seabirds. So to account for the seabirds, I use data from field surveys on where the birds exist, from field surveys on boats, and then estimates of how vulnerable different bird species are to getting struck by these turbines. And I combine the two into a vulnerability map. These maps here show you the survey locations. You can see it's a big data set in the North Pacific. And if we zoom into the Central Coast, we can see a lot of surveys. It's this dark blue line here that's really of interest because it has a lot of surveys and a lot of replicates, which means it's reliable data. These other locations, they have surveys, but each survey is several kilometers apart from each other, so it's less reliable, and I didn't use it in the analysis for that reason. There's too much scattering in. Okay, and then this is the seabird vulnerability metric. And all I really want you guys to get from this is that the x-axis here is a whole bunch of seabird species that are detected off the Central Coast of California. And the y-axis here is the population collision vulnerability. The higher the bar, the more vulnerable that bird species is to getting whacked by a turbine. So for example, the brown pelican has high vulnerability, and it has to do with the flight height of the pelican and the fact that they have very large, slow turning radiuses. So it's hard for them to avoid a turbine blade coming swinging down. Conversely, this other bird here, this is the ancient murrelet. It has a very low vulnerability, and it's because of a different flight height and a much tighter turning radius and faster reaction speed, so it can avoid that turbine blade. So I weighted all of the bird survey population data by these vulnerability estimates in order to come up with a bird vulnerability map. And that's what we have here on the right. And it's very sparse. You can see most of the Central Coast has no data. We've really focused on this one line here where there's a lot of survey data and it's reliable. That's really actually not that big of a problem because there's a consistent pattern we see here. And the pattern is that the bird vulnerability decreases with distance from shore. We see a lot of yellow and green close to shore and then dark blue far from shore, indicating high vulnerability close to shore, lower vulnerability far from shore. And this is not a surprise. Other projects have found the sensitivity or vulnerability of birds to wind turbines to decrease dramatically from shore. This is a figure from a study in Europe. And in fact, our data is so consistent that we can fit a line through it. Line represents a simple model of bird vulnerability, and the points represent all these locations here. We can fit a line through it, and that line represents about half, it captures about half of the explanatory power of our empirical data. And this is great because it means we can then use this line to then populate the rest of this map. And that's what I've done right here. So now we populated the rest of the map. It's not high resolution estimates of bird vulnerability, but it is a big high level perspective on what we see. And the general pattern we see is that the vulnerability is lowest far from shore. And so that tells us, yeah, this wind energy area is well positioned because it's far from shore. As far as some of the other options we brought up, well, we can't go further west, even though the vulnerability drops, because it's too deep for the turbines. We can't go northwest because of the National Marine Sanctuary, or southwest because we run into fishing grounds, or we get into too deep of a habitat. Point Conception is a little bit of an uncertainty here. The model says that the vulnerability is very high near Point Conception because it's close to shore, and that's this yellow here. However, notice there's one data point right here where they did do a bunch of bird surveys and they found very few birds there, or birds that were not very vulnerable. So either the data is an extreme outlier and shouldn't be trusted, and we should trust the model, or vice versa. So either way, it leaves us not quite knowing if Point Conception should be a contender or not. So hang on to that until we get to Wales, which is right now. So similar to the bird map, we generated a whale map where we took into account the whale population distribution using field surveys and also data on the oceanography and the habitat that the whales like, and using that to extrapolate to other locations. And then I weighted this data by the conservation status of the whales to take into account those whales whose populations are extremely endangered, and also by the morphology of the whales. Some whales, like large whales, like to rub against hard structures to knock the barnacles off them. So they're more susceptible to getting entangled by these turbines because they have hard structures. Also, baleen whales are typically more susceptible to being caught up in fishing gear because of their engulfing of large prey, and they can trap the fishing gear in their baleen. So I weighted more heavily towards these type species. Okay, here's our map of cetacean population vulnerability. Once again, we can see the vulnerability is lowest, farthest from shore, and also in the northwest direction. So this gives us that same message that the wind energy area is well positioned. As far as the other options, we already know we can't go to the northwest because of the National Marine Sanctuary, even though whale vulnerability is less there. And now we have some clear results that the Point Conception area is also not a good idea because of the high whale traffic. And what's happening here is the whales migrating north or south, they come through the Santa Barbara Channel. That's between the Channel Islands and Santa Barbara. And so they're rounding the corner of Point Conception. So we see a lot of whales at Point Conception. So it would not be a good idea to put a big array of wind turbines there. Okay, so at the scale of the Central Coast, the wind energy area seems to be pretty well positioned in relation to energy, fisheries, and marine wildlife conservation perspectives. Let's now zoom into the wind energy area in particular. So this is the wind energy area where the development is most likely going to happen. And I've highlighted the three different leases, the purple, green, and yellow areas. And on the right here are the maps of those three objectives specific to the wind energy area. So we've got the megawatts of power produced, that could be produced. We've got the current fisheries value, which is highest in the to the east and to the southeast. We've got the seabird and cetacean vulnerabilities, which are also highest to the east and the southeast. So looking at these three maps, the first takeaway is that the minimum conflict sites, if someone told you, hey, where do you want to put this one turbine? Well, putting it in the purple lease area all the way out to the west is going to have the minimum conflict among these four objectives because it has the highest wind power potential, the lowest current fisheries activity, and the lowest vulnerability of seabirds and cetaceans. Okay, now let's look at each of the lease areas in their entirety and how each lease area, what it produces or what it could impact. So first, let's look at what it could produce as far as energy power, as far as megawatts. So these are the three lease areas. You can see these bars are all about the same height, even though there's stronger winds in the far western purple lease. The reason why these bars are at about the same height, producing similar megawatts of power, is because the green and yellow lease areas are slightly larger, so they can have one or a couple more turbines to make up for the fact that the power per turbine is less. Let's look at fisheries now. Okay, we see a pretty different story here now. We see the current fisheries activity is quite low, relatively low in the western purple or the central green lease area, and relatively speaking, it's much higher in the eastern yellow lease area. So this tells us that the potential loss in fisheries value is especially high in the eastern yellow lease area compared with the other two. Okay, now let's look at the birds and the cetaceans, the whales and dolphins. We see here that the vulnerability increases as we go from west to east, but it's a gradual increase. So this tells us that we would expect to see changes in vulnerability depending which one of these lease blocks got developed or how much they get developed, but the change is not dramatic. It's a subtle, gradual change. So overall, this tells us that the vulnerability of the birds and the cetaceans is relatively even across the entire wind energy area, whereas the big change in the fisheries bars shows us that fishery value is quite variable or spatially heterogeneous across the wind energy area. And for this reason, this indicates that there's potential for us to choose locations within the leases where fishing is low, but energy is still high in order to minimize impacts on the fisheries. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on fisheries and energy. Okay, so energy and fisheries. So here are those two maps of energy value and fisheries value. We've got high energy to the east and high current fisheries value to the west. We can put these two maps together to create a new map that tells us where it might be best to put turbines in order to generate lots of power with minimum impact. And the way we put these two maps together is we simply divide the top one by the bottom one. And it generates this new map, which is like a suitability or selection frequency map. Locations that are yellow here, that's high values, they indicate locations that have lots of wind power and or low current fisheries value. So those are good spots to put a turbine. Conversely, blue spots indicate areas that have lower wind power and or higher fisheries value. So they're less suitable for wind energy development in relation to these two objectives. We can take this map here and we can start to build out hypothetical wind farms that constitute 1 turbine or 10 turbines or 100 turbines or all 235 turbines that I estimate could fill up the entire wind energy area. And the outcome of those wind farm designs on fisheries and on energy is depicted by this map here. So this line here, this blue line, represents 235 different spatial plans of wind farm design, starting from 1 turbine to 2 turbines to 3 turbines, all the way down to 235, and the entire wind farm filled up. For example, this point on the blue line here represents one of the plans that has 76 turbines and produces about the same amount of megawatts on average that any one of the 3 leases is expected to produce. So let's look at the 3 leases in comparison on this plot. Here's where they fall out. We've got the westernmost lease in purple, the central one in green, and the eastern one in yellow. And you can see how the western and central one, they're very close to the blue line, which indicates they're good leases for balancing these two objectives. It's the eastern one that does not do a good job at minimizing impacts to the fishery, given the amount of power that it produces. We can take this same analysis and we can apply it to each of the lease blocks in order to guide how development could happen inside each of the lease blocks. So let's do that for each of the lease blocks. This is the westernmost lease block, and now we've created that suitability map where we're dividing energy value by fisheries value to then identify the hotspots, the yellow here, where it would be a good place to put a turbine to generate lots of power at minimal fisheries impact. And then we can populate a curve that indicates all the different farms that could fill up just that western lease block, from 1 turbine to 2 turbines, all the way out to, I think there's 77 that could fit in this western lease block. And I've got 3 triangles here, just indicating hypothetically, let's say the winner of this lease block decided to aim for, say, 25% of maximum energy production, or 50%, or 75%. And let's just focus on 50% for an example. Let's say they focused on 50%. Well, this is the plan on this blue line that produces 50% of the maximum power in the western lease block and minimizes the impact on the fisheries. By comparison, here is the map that one would look at if one were only interested in energy power production, but we're not considering trying to reduce fisheries impacts. And we can look at what those plans would look like. And I've highlighted the 3 here that correspond with the 25% energy production, 50%, and 75% energy production. And let's look at the 50% one for comparison. So over here, we have the energy plan that produces the same amount of megawatts as the one above it. They're both 50% of maximum capacity of that lease. But this one is doing it without trying to reduce impacts on the fisheries, whereas the one above is trying to reduce impacts on the fisheries. The difference between these triangles and these circles indicates the value to the fisheries industry from trying to think carefully about where to put these turbines to minimize fisheries impacts. So this difference here, and for example, in this example we've looked at, it's about 30-some% of a gain in fisheries value, or another way to say it is avoiding losses in fisheries value from choosing the plan up top as opposed to the plan on the bottom. Okay, so we did this for the western block, and we saw this. There's no change in power. There's about 38% gain in fisheries or avoided loss. The variance here is because we're kind of uncertain. Maybe some fisheries activity could happen inside that wind energy area. So we accounted for that, and that's why we have this variability. This is the same result, 50% power, but now for the central block. And this is the analysis done once again for the eastern block. And so in each one of these situations, we've got avoided losses to the fishery. And you can see it drops down to a lower value here for the eastern one, even though the fisheries are more valuable in the eastern block. And the reason why is because most of the groundfish fishery activity is actually in the far eastern edge of the block. So whether or not you have this wind farm design or this one up here really only has a 10% effect on the fisheries value, which is noteworthy, but just not as large as these others. The actual magnitude effect, though, the dollar value of choosing this farm over this farm is much higher than it is for the central or eastern block farms over the alternative, because there's just so much more at stake for the fisheries in this eastern block because there's more fishing activity. All of these percents, by the way, they add up in dollar value to pretty small numbers, to something like maybe $10,000 a year in revenue, in fisheries revenue. So it's a pretty small number, especially when you think about the millions or billions of dollars associated with the wind energy farm development. However, I think it's important to be fair to the fishing industry and point out that, Morro Bay is a small vessel fishing operation where it's not very lucrative. And also there's really only a handful of vessels operating out in that wind energy area. So $10,000 a year actually means something to the fisheries industry. Okay, so in conclusion, on the Central Coast, the wind energy area seems to be pretty well positioned for high potential power and low impacts. The whale and seabird vulnerabilities are concentrated closer to shore, and the fisheries activity is either closer to shore or it's just not within the wind energy area. So that's good news. Within the wind energy area, the western locations, that purple western lease, that seems to have more power and less, or the locations out there have more power and less fisheries and wildlife conflict. And among the lease blocks, they all seem to produce about the same amount of power, but the eastern one has greater conflicts with birds, whales, and especially with fisheries. And if we think about farm design within the lease block, definitely the configuration matters. And if we took into account these fisheries, seabird, and whale objectives through careful planning, we could prevent unnecessary losses. And I showed you how unnecessary losses to fisheries value in particular could be achieved. With that, I'll say thank you and hand it back to Neil.
All right. Thanks very much, Crow. We have several questions here, and I'd like to kind of run through some of them. I don't think we have time to do all of them, but we'll do what we can, and I've kind of merged a couple of them. One question that came up, and this is for either of the presenters to answer, or both if you wish. One person commented on the visibility study and said, well, does that change at night if there's lighting for safety reasons or things like that? So things that might not be visible during the day, would they be visible at night, or would there be visible lighting?
Well, I guess I'll take that one. The answer is that distance-wise, you could potentially see the lights at night because lights shine brighter unless it's beyond the horizon. So maybe like the first or the second row of the turbines could be visible, but not further out. However, there are technologies today where the lights go on only when there is an aircraft in the area. And if you think about it, what are the aircraft that fly that far out? You'll very quickly realize that it's either going to be military aircraft, or which is going to be pretty high up because they don't have to come to 1,500 feet of altitude until they get to the shoreline. So they will never turn on the lights. Commercial aircraft that comes out of St. Louis Obispo Airport does not fly that far out. They make a turn east or west, east or north, about 5 miles offshore. And the installation would be closer to 25 through 60 miles offshore. So the lights probably will not go on unless there is a specific general aviation aircraft that happen to be at the right altitude at the right distance. And even the general aviation aircraft, which is, you know, 2-seater, 4-seater, or business jets, they too do not go that far off. So it is conceivable that the lights may never go on at night, but the lights will be there. They're just designed to turn on when there is aircraft in the area. As far as the other lighting that will be on the platform, it's the lighting that put on the perimeter of the platform, depending on whatever that configuration is, and it's more for the vessel traffic, not the aircraft. Those lights will not be visible from shore because they're too low compared to the distance and the altitude. Even from Hearst Castle, you're not going to see them. So I strongly doubt that there will be any visibility of lights just because of those conditions.
Okay. Another question had to do with the characteristics of the moorings. Are they drilled into the ground, or just relying on the weight of the anchorage, let's call it, to hold the cables and the turbine and the floating turbines in place?
They're not drilled into the ocean floor. That happens when you put fixed foundations. You actually have to do so-called piling, and you drill and put the foundations in. These could be drag-embedded anchors, literally the same anchor type as used on the boats, where you drag it in and it goes deep into the soil, into the ocean floor itself. It could be a torpedo anchor, which is kind of shoot into and gets embedded in the ocean floor. It could be suction anchors, which is actually the anchor that you put on the floor, and then you suction out the air and it stays there because of the suction. Most installations today use drag embedded anchors or near vertical launch anchors, which are very similar type. They are very similar to what you would use on a boat. They're just very, very large because the structures are much larger than the boats.
Okay, another question. Had one person asked why the Central Coast? Is there consideration of such areas off of the coast of Southern California?
No, there are no considerations in Southern California because the wind resource dies down. Effectively, we're in the area, as you remember Crow's chart on the wind resource, where you passed Catalina Islands and there is really no wind resource. Reason being that the closer you get to the equator, the less wind you have because the winds are generated best between 30 and 60 degrees of latitude. And we're just too far south for any wind to be there because the winds are basically the jet streams, they're in the atmosphere and they just don't go that far south. You know, there are different resources available closer to equator. It's mostly sun and some other marine renewables like salinity gradient and others, but not the wind.
Okay.
I'll add to that an area south of Santa Rosa Island, part of the Channel Islands, was considered a while back because it's windy, but that was taken off the table pretty early in the decision-making process.
Okay, we had quite a number of questions that just came in, and I'll try to pick among some of them. Here's an interesting one. If there should be a tsunami or major earthquake, how would the wind turbines be affected?
That's a very good question. And I would, and Crow, please jump in, whatever I did not answer right. You may remember the tsunami in the Indian Ocean in December a few years ago. And you may or may not know that boats that did not get damaged by the tsunami were the boats that were in the deep water. They kind of floated over that long, long way. Because what is the tsunami? Tsunami is a very big wave. But tsunami waves become destructive when they hit the bottom of the ocean floor. And we're in the water depth where that will not happen because we're in 800 to 1,000 meter water depth, which is 2,400 to 3,000 feet the water depth. And that hitting the bottom of the ocean floor comes closer to shore. So when the wave comes in, and what you have to do is design the mooring that this amplitude of the wave will be sustained by the mooring line, and the platform will just float over, similar as the boats did in the Indian Ocean when they were further offshore. But you don't want to be too close to shore because that's when the destructive forces occur. It's when the wave hits the floor and it amplifies, and it considers amplification as it comes to the floor and to shore. And then it becomes very destructive.
Here's a question about timing. If the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management process takes about 7 years, when would power be generated and available for consumer use?
After 7 years.
How long is there any kind of notion of when the go-ahead is given?
Yeah. The objective is to have power fed into the grid around 2030, but it may be a little bit longer depending on how the process is going to go. If there is a way to speed up the process, which is people are certainly looking at it, developers will do it as fast as they can because they're spending money up front. There will be project financing, and they want to plug into the grid as quickly as possible because they need to start generating revenue. But it all depends on the permitting process.
Okay, and that's a good segue into several participants asked about costs. And the timing of costs, that things are continuing to increase in cost. And does this project actually pencil out? And will it pencil out in the future? And are there opportunities and plans for cost sharing, for example, of any kind of land-based facilities that might be supporting either the construction.
Well, I think because of the infrastructure being so limited, there is no choice but a need to share infrastructure. There is just no choice. When some other locations in Europe or maybe on the East Coast, a developer may have sole rights to a shipyard, there is no such opportunity on Central Coast, just none exists. And so because of that, infrastructure will have to be shared, no matter what you do. And I think we're going to see developers cooperating with each other, becoming frenemies, doing something together. But that's because of the necessity and may not be because of their choice. Each developer normally likes to have its own abilities, but in this particular location, it will have to be shared. Cost-wise, people would not be paying what they paid for the leases if the projects did not pencil out. I think it all comes down to how much energy you can generate. And if you remember my first graph, offshore, we can generate almost 2 or 3 times as much as could be generated onshore. The turbines are going to be generating probably 15 megawatts each. Even the picture that I showed you was 8 to 8.5 megawatt, which was installation in Portugal just 3 years ago. Now we're going to twice as much power already. And so it's all economies of scale, but that's what drives things. And that's why people going offshore, because of the amount of energy you can generate and you need to generate. I think there was one question asking, why do offshore wind? Because it is expensive, because you need to put billions of dollars in infrastructure, whatever. Yes, you do. But at the same time, we need more energy. You know, with the electrification of everything, you have to get energy somewhere, and continue burning fossil fuel is only destructing the environment and destructing the climate and making the climate not suitable for human or any marine life for that matter. And so again, we have no choice but do it. And that's one of the better resources that today have not been tapped into on the West Coast at all. And that's why, in a way, I do what I do. Stir up the pot and push it forward and make sure that as much offshore wind is done as possible. But at the same time, technology advances and we can reduce the cost with experience, with time. You look at any industry you want to take. At the beginning, costs are always higher. As you go through and as you gain experience and economies of scale, cost will reduce.
Okay. I had a question. One question came up, which was one of the participants, and I actually had this question myself, and that is crossing the undersea cables is a new, this person said, new issue to me. Is there experience in dealing with this kind of problems since new cables would be buried? So I guess the issue of cables crossing each other, how is that dealt with?
The cable crossing does exist in Europe. I'm not an expert on that. I can't really answer that. The site that I identified back in 2016, as Crow showed on his first chart, was actually the eastern site that ended up to be in the lease area energy. And to me, I was avoiding crossing the telecom cables, but there are methodologies and technologies that do exist. I just cannot answer what they are, but things like that do happen in Europe quite a bit.
Okay. There was a question about the total potential of 1,442 megawatts. The writer felt that was perhaps low, and is that the total amount that's believed to be able to be generated, or how did that figure? How did we arrive at that number?
Yeah, I can feel that. That number now is low, and every like 6 months it gets updated because the megawatt capacity of these turbines increases. The model that ran the figure 1400 was, I think, a 10 or 12 megawatt turbine, whereas now we're up to 15. Also, turbine spacing is a factor that comes into play. How far apart or close together are these turbines going to be, which affects how many you can put in a given area. And so that So if you increase up to 15 megawatts and then pack them in a little bit tighter, given some new technology assumptions, then it does go up. It doesn't, from my understanding, the entire wind energy area, if built out with 15 megawatt turbines, still does not quite meet the power output of Diablo Canyon nuclear power plants. So I think it's a little under that right now, but give it another 7 years and the turbines might be 18 megawatts and it would be.
Well, I guess I will have to disagree with Crow on that one because using NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, has an estimate of 3 megawatts per kilometer square. Industry number is more like 5 megawatts per kilometer square. And so when you really look at the number that industry uses and has demonstrated as reality, you can get to twice as much generation as the Diablo Canyon power plant. So from the industry perspective, if the whole area is built out, it can generate about 4 gigawatts of power. Now, the capacity factor, which is how much energy can you extract or generate out of the available resource, we are certainly not 100% capacity factor, which is what the nuclear plant is going to be. This is closer to 60, 50, 60%. So it will be less in total.
Uh-oh. Okay, I think we may have lost we may have lost Alla here for a second. Crow, are you still there?
I'm here.
Yep.
You cannot hear me?
Oh, okay. You got muted for a
Really?
bit. Yeah.
Hmm.
At least on it was my computer. Here's another question. And I think this is for Crow. I'm not quite sure I'm following it, so I'm going to just read it to you verbatim, Crow, and it goes, can you expound on what you said at the end about the Morro Bay fisheries? I did not quite understand what you meant about the Morro Bay fishery being small.
Well, so Morro Bay is a pretty shallow water port, and that limits the size of the vessels that can come into Morro Bay. Every year we're dredging that port just so it's deep enough to handle a boat that's a little over 100 feet. So as a result, the vast majority of the vessels, the fishing vessels in Morro Bay are 60 foot, 40 foot in size, which is relatively small compared with larger ports to the south of us, like Long Beach, or if you head up north, the San Francisco Bay Area, or even Monterey Bay has a deeper water port, or especially if you go up to Oregon. So we're a smaller scale fleet in that sense, which means that each boat is not making as much money. And on top of that, there are very few boats actually fishing out in that wind energy area. So putting those two together basically is trying to highlight the fact that a few thousand extra dollars in an area out there can have a significant effect because it's affecting just a couple fishermen that are fishing that area, and their industry is not very lucrative, especially for small scale boats like we have in Morro Bay.
Okay, I think we're getting close to our conclusion here. I'll try to take one more question. Here's where there was one here that I thought, with climate change and water temperature changes, are there changes to be expected, and can they be predicted, having to do with either bird migration or fish or cetacean movements?
Ooh, that's a difficult one. The climate change will affect migratory routes. Having an accurate prediction of how that's going to change on the US West Coast does not exist at the moment, from my understanding. The general pattern of these species following the continental shelf is probably not going to change much. I think what will change is where their final destination is, up way north in the Arctic, because they're going to travel further north to get to the cold waters and the nutrient-rich systems up there. So I think it'll affect more the endpoint of their migration and not necessarily whether their migration moves further offshore or gets closer to shore. But that's a little bit of speculation, I want to admit.
There we go. Okay. I think our time is up. I want to thank everybody for their participation and for their patience in our attempting to answer the questions that we got. The last question that came in is, where can we access the recording of this Zoom? And we'll get back to you with that one. I'll type something in here shortly, okay? To Natalie. Anyway, thank you all for your participation. And I think that concludes our presentation today. Thanks again, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.